Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. Settle in, and let's begin. It was a Wednesday afternoon of particular serenity in St. Mary Mead, when Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit her old acquaintance, Mrs. Weatherby, a widow of impeccable discretion and florally inclined habits. "The chrysanthemums this year," she remarked, "were uncharacteristically vigorous," a point that Mrs. Weatherby met with both pride and a touch of worry over slugs. But gardening pleasantries soon gave way to the more intriguing matter at hand. Mrs. Weatherby had taken in a lodger. "He's very quiet," she said, as she poured out a delicate stream of Darjeeling. "Polite, punctual, and never late for breakfast." The lodger's name was Mr. Elliot Crane, a middle-aged gentleman with a scholar's posture and an air of unassuming propriety. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and spent much of his time reading in the drawing-room or walking alone at peculiar hours. A small trunk and one valise made up the sum of his possessions, all neatly arranged and touched by H. Miss Marple, with her lace gloves resting neatly in her lap, made note of the man's entrance and the quiet with which he moved, as though sound were an imposition. His manner was gentlemanly, his attire tidy, though several seasons behind fashion. When introduced, he inclined his head, offered the sort of smile that never quite reached the eyes, and returned to his reading, without comment. It was a brief encounter, but enough, Miss Marple thought, to tell her that Mr. Crane was not a man one should overlook. Over the following fortnight, Mr. Crane became something of a fixture in the Weatherby household, though one could hardly accuse him of being sociable. When asked what occupied his time, he replied with quiet precision that he was researching a book on 18th-century English timepieces, a subject, he added, rich in both craftsmanship and metaphor. Miss Marple, who had encountered a fair number of so-called gentlemen scholars in her lifetime, was not entirely satisfied with the reply. There was, she observed, a manner about Mr. Crane's answers that spoke less of secrecy and more of calculated omission. His speech was always carefully curated, his references to places vague, and his anecdotes unfailingly general. It was Mrs. Weatherby who noticed that, while Mr. Crane claimed to write, she had yet to observe a single page of manuscript. His fountain pen was rarely unkept, and though he visited the local library, he never borrowed any books. Miss Marple remarked quite mildly that there was a certain irony in studying clocks while having no apparent concern for the passage of time. Mr. Crane, who overheard her from the parlor doorway, gave a faint, unreadable smile. Later, in conversation with the grocer's wife, Miss Marple mused that the study of clocks might be a perfectly respectable occupation, but only if the interest in mechanisms extended beyond those of a decorative nature. There was, she felt, a difference between a man who observed time and one who waited for it. As was inevitable in a village where hedgerows carried whispers better than bird-song, talk of Mr. Crane began to seep quietly through the community. It began with harmless wonder, his solitary walks at odd hours, his reluctance to engage in Sunday church, his habit of watching the village sundial for long, silent stretches of time. The butcher's wife claimed he walked as if retracing a path from memory, stopping at corners for no apparent reason. The postmistress, with a certain relish, noted that he received envelopes each Wednesday, pale, unmarked, and without return addresses. Mrs. Hartwell, who had once rented rooms herself, declared it not at all the behavior of a proper guest. Mrs. Weatherby, ever loyal to her lodger's decorum, brushed it all aside with a polite sniff. But privately she confessed to Miss Marple that he had once left the front door ajar at midnight, returning shortly after with no explanation, and damp shoes. Miss Marple listened without interruption, the rhythmic clicking of her needles the only sound between reflections. It was not the walking or the solitude that troubled her. It was the restraint, the kind of quiet one must practice, not possess. More curious still was the fact that Mr. Crane, who claimed little attachment to the village, had developed a particular fascination with the Weatherby garden, or more precisely, the ancient sundial nestled among the foxgloves. He visited it daily, always at the same hour, always alone. What he was watching for, no one could say. One night a chill set upon St. Mary Mead, with the kind of damp certainty that only September could bring. Mrs. Weatherby, on her way to retrieve an extra quilt for her knees, happened to pass her lodger's door and paused, as any curious soul might, upon hearing murmured speech from within. The words were faint, distorted by sleep, but one name surfaced clearly: Marian. The next morning, over toast and boiled eggs, Mrs. Weatherby mentioned the incident to Miss Marple, her tone a mixture of apology and intrigue. Miss Marple did not laugh. She never did when the inexplicable brushed shoulders with the ordinary. Instead, she tucked the name away like a bookmark in a mystery novel. She recalled with some clarity that Mr. Crane had been particularly still the evening before, gazing at the sundial as though time itself might answer back. There was something too deliberate in his pacing, too precise in the way he mocked the stone with his eyes, as though he were waiting for it to reveal something. Miss Marple, being of a generation raised on the notion that the past never quite stays buried, considered that there were only two reasons a man would watch a sundial so intently. Either he longed for a moment gone, or he expected one to return. And in either case, the mention of a woman's name in the dead of night, unbidden and raw, was never without its consequences. Who was Marian? And why had time not let her go? Miss Marple had long held the opinion that vicars' wives, though unfailingly kind-hearted and prone to modesty, were also the keepers of the most exquisitely tuned radar for impropriety. And so when Mrs. Anstruther arrived at the Bluebell Society tea with the flustered look of a woman burdened by the weight of a moral quandary, Miss Marple received her remarks with due gravity. "It's the spoons," the good woman began, rather more directly than usual. "The silver ones, the set we received for our wedding. 2 are gone." Miss Marple raised a gentle brow. Such things were not uncommon. Children often borrowed them for play, or housemaids for less innocent ventures. But the vicarage had neither. Mrs. Anstruther had searched high and low, she said, even beneath the sofa cushions and in the asparagus dish which she rarely used. There had been no visitors save for the Women's Guild Committee, and one other. Mr. Crane, she added quietly. He came with a note from Mrs. Weatherby, a request to borrow the vicar's old edition of the Lives of the Saints. That in itself was nothing to remark upon, but the spoons had vanished that same afternoon. Mrs. Anstruther naturally would say nothing to Mrs. Weatherby, for she remained fond of the woman and her roses. Still the coincidence gnawed at her. Miss Marple offered no immediate opinion, but later that evening she quietly took down the name of the silversmith who had engraved the set, and made a mental note to observe Mr. Crane's fingertips the next time he poured his tea. Not long after the spoon incident, young Ivy Latimer, a candid girl of 12 with a fondness for her own voice, recounted a curious tale to her older brother, which, through the usual village channels, made its way to Miss Marple by week's end. She had seen the lodger, she said, skulking near the old gardener's cottage at dusk, a place long unused and shuttered since old Moffat's passing 2 years prior. Ivy insisted that Mr. Crane had emerged from behind the cottage with what looked like papers tucked under his arm, though she admitted it might just as easily have been a folded coat. Her brother had teased her, of course, calling it storybook nonsense, but Ivy had insisted. "He looked guilty, Aunt Jane," she later told Miss Marple earnestly, when prompted. "Like someone caught out where they oughtn't be." Miss Marple offered a kind smile and asked whether the gentleman had noticed her. He didn't look up, just kept walking with his head down. It was, of course, likely nothing, and yet Miss Marple found herself wondering why a man who claimed no familiarity with the village would wander near an abandoned place known only to long-time residents, and why, if he had nothing to hide, he had chosen the hour when dusk concealed more than it revealed. Some days later, as Miss Marple partook of lemon sponge at Mrs. Weatherby's parlor table, the conversation drifted, as it often did, to small domestic puzzles that were not so small, once properly examined. "I must be losing my senses," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, lifting her teacup with a distracted hand. "I could have sworn I'd locked that drawer." She referred with vague agitation to the mahogany cabinet in her late husband's study, the one that housed his medals from the war and the small photograph album from their Cairo years. She had not opened it in weeks, yet something had changed. The medals had been disturbed. Their ribbon colors, once carefully ordered, were reversed. The Victoria Cross, always central, now sat to the far left. No items were missing, and yet the arrangement bore the unmistakable touch of a hand other than hers. Mrs. Weatherby had no staff. Only Mr. Crane had entered that room on a rainy day when she had invited him to browse the bookshelves. She remembered thinking how oddly he had paused at the desk, not rudely but with too much interest for a stranger. Miss Marple inquired mildly whether Mr. Crane had served in the military. "No," Mrs. Weatherby replied with a puzzled frown. "He said he was too young at the time." Miss Marple, for her part, said very little, but as she returned home that evening, she reflected that only someone with an understanding of honor would bother to rearrange medals, and only someone with something to find would risk unlocking another man's drawer. Miss Marple, who considered postal workers the most reliable barometers of village activity after vicars' wives, made a quiet visit to the post office under the natural pretext of purchasing 2 penny stamps. Her conversation with Miss Peebles, a woman of subtle intelligence and ample time behind the sorting desk, yielded what she already suspected. Each Wednesday Mr. Crane received a single envelope, always the same, plain ivory-colored, with precise black ink, and no return address. It was delivered in the early post and collected promptly by the gentleman himself, who never spoke of it but treated it with a carefulness bordering on reverence. He never posted anything in reply. "He reads it by the hedge," Miss Peebles added in a voice not quite a whisper, "then tears it into strips and burns it in Mrs. Weatherby's stove. Saw the ashes myself last Thursday, perfectly white." Miss Marple thanked her with gentle discretion and returned home with a mind already arranging pieces. She had no proof of wrongdoing, of course, but anonymous correspondence arriving with clockwork precision had little place in a village where birthdays, condolences, and church circulars made up the bulk of written exchange. That Mr. Crane was receiving such letters was one matter. That he destroyed them, silently and completely, suggested not that he feared others reading them, but that he himself could not bear to keep them. It was not the mark of a criminal, she thought, but rather of someone to whom memory had become a burden. And memory, as Miss Marple well knew, was the most persistent of ghosts, capable of slipping through keyholes, surviving fire, and always arriving on time. The trouble with long-held secrets, Miss Marple often reflected, was not that they died, but that they waited, sometimes in the most inconvenient company. Such was the case one Friday afternoon, when a whispered name resurfaced on the lips of Mrs. Mapleton, who had never once told a story she did not believe herself to be at the center of. It was during a charitable sewing circle of all things that the rumor began. Mrs. Mapleton, having glanced through a tatty society column from 20 years past, was reminded of a certain Elliot Marston, a London gentleman once accused, though never convicted, in the suicide of a young woman of good family. Not proven, she had said with relish, as though acquittal carried its own scandal, but enough to end him socially, disappeared entirely, quite vanished. The name Elliot Marston settled into Miss Marple's memory like a dropped stitch. There was no direct connection, yet the similarity was too precise to be dismissed. Elliot Crane, Elliot Marston, the same thoughtful bearing, the same restraint of a man once burned. She made discreet inquiries, not with directness, which was never her way, but with the skill of one who had spent a lifetime listening to what others discarded as background noise. And the pattern emerged. Mr. Crane had arrived with no references, no family visited, no anecdotes from youth. He moved not like a stranger seeking new beginnings, but as a man navigating familiar territory in a different name. The scandal, long buried in the city, had never reached the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. But now, with whispers mounting, Miss Marple sensed the roots were stirring, and where roots stirred, something old, and perhaps dangerous, was sure to surface. The final indication came by way of a simple error, or what appeared to be one. On the third Wednesday of October, the envelope that arrived bore not the name Mr. Elliot Crane, but instead, Miss Marion Cresswell. The handwriting was the same, elegant, deliberate, the envelope identical in size and weight, but the name did not belong to any living soul in the village. Miss Peebles, startled by the anomaly, hesitated just long enough for Miss Marple, quite by chance of course, to observe the name before it was replaced. Marion Cresswell. The same name Mr. Crane had murmured in his sleep, the same name connected by village rumor to the old London scandal. The letter was collected without reaction, though Miss Peebles swore that Mr. Crane's hands trembled as he took it. Later that evening smoke rose from the Weatherby chimney, precisely as it did every Wednesday. But this time Miss Marple stood quite still outside her parlor window, watching the smoke spiral upward. It was not the fire she studied. It was the fact that Mr. Crane had received a letter, not addressed to him, but to a woman, long dead. And no man, she thought quietly, receives mail for a ghost, unless he still believes she's listening. It was Mrs. Weatherby's gardener who found her, though gardener was by local standards a generous term for a man who arrived twice weekly and preferred pruning to planting. Elsie, the maid-of-all-work, lay motionless by the sundial, her arms splayed at an unnatural angle, one hand clenched stubbornly around an object whose metallic glint caught the morning light. The village reacted with horror tempered by restraint, for nothing traveled more swiftly than the phrase, "Poor girl, but such a quiet one." Whispers rose at once, that she'd fallen, that she'd fainted, that it must have been the heart. Though Elsie was not yet 23, and the sort to scoff at liniment and swore she could outrun the baker's boy. Miss Marple, summoned by instinct more than alarm, arrived just as Dr. Pendleton was closing his bag and pronouncing the matter most concerning. The object in the girl's hand was an antique watch, gold, engraved. Its hand stopped at 6:17. It was not hers, nor known to be in Mrs. Weatherby's possession. The sundial, too, bore marks, faint scuffing along the base, and a deep impression where Elsie's head had struck the soil. Yet no signs of struggle were evident. Miss Marple, her eyes lingering on the girl's shoes, noted what others missed. The soles were nearly spotless, untouched by dew or earth. She had not walked to the sundial. She had been placed there. And the watch, a curious thing to clutch in death, unless it had been meant as a message, or, more likely, as a misdirection. By the following morning, the hush that blanketed St. Mary Mead had shifted from shock to a peculiar kind of watchfulness, a collective holding of breath, as though waiting for the next leaf to fall. Dr. Pendleton, his expression unusually tight, confirmed the preliminary findings. Digitalis, a deadly poison in the wrong hands, derived from the foxglove, a flower as common in country gardens as lavender or larkspur, and just as easily overlooked. But the concentration found in Elsie's bloodstream was not the result of idle foraging. It had been prepared, measured, administered with precision. The villagers, having little taste for clinical terms, fell upon the word with grim satisfaction. Poison meant intent. Intent meant murder. And murder, in a place where most quarrels concerned sponge recipes and stolen bicycle pumps, struck with the horror of something foreign, unwelcome, and deeply unsettling. Miss Marple, who had once seen a woman murdered by jealousy in the guise of a friendly cough mixture, found the details less remarkable than the reaction. The village was not merely frightened. It was disturbed by the implication that one of its own, or someone recently among them, had wielded the knowledge and nerve to poison. And yet the key was not how Elsie died, it was why, and Miss Marple, casting her mind back to the locked drawer of medals, the envelope addressed to a dead woman, and the watch too old for a servant to own, found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether the poison had been meant for someone else. The inevitable questions reached Mr. Crane by afternoon, though he offered his answers with the same quiet detachment that had marked his arrival. He had been walking, he said, as was his custom, along the western edge of the woods, where the blackberry brambles had not yet been harvested. He carried no watch, and had passed no one. Mrs. Weatherby confirmed that she had seen him leave shortly before 5, but could not say when he returned. His manner was calm, courteous. Yet beneath that layer of composed civility, Miss Marple detected something sharper, not fear precisely, but an acute awareness of the knife edge on which he now stood. His voice did not waver, but his hands, always so precise, folded more than once upon themselves. It was not the protest of innocence that drew Miss Marple's attention. It was the absence of outrage. The man behaved not as one falsely accused, but as one long accustomed to suspicion, one for whom silence had become a shield. And when he inquired, with something like resignation, whether Elsie had been in possession of anything unusual, Miss Marple noted the choice of phrasing. He did not ask how she died. He asked what she'd found. Though much had been made of the hour in which Elsie died, Miss Marple turned her attention, with characteristic delicacy, to the hour in which she last truly lived. Mrs. Weatherby, with an expression caught between grief and embarrassment, had mentioned, almost in passing, that Elsie had spent that very morning dusting the upstairs bedrooms, including Mr. Crane's. It had not been her usual assignment. The maid had asked specifically to attend to the guest room, citing the desire to freshen up the corners. The request, though unremarkable on its surface, now took on a different hue. Mr. Crane had not been present at the time. He had gone, as he often did on a morning walk of deliberate length, and so Elsie had been alone, with time, privacy, and, as Miss Marple well understood, curiosity. What might she have found? Mrs. Weatherby reported nothing unusual disturbed. No drawers left open, no books misplaced. But a quiet thoroughness often escaped notice, and Elsie, according to the other staff, had a habit of straightening what wasn't crooked. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the antique watch, a man's timepiece, too fine for a village maid, too sentimental to be casually discarded. It had been in her hand at the moment of death, not in her pocket, not hidden. No one clutches what they intend to return. Elsie had found something, and whatever it was, she had decided to keep it. It was not until the second afternoon that Miss Marple quietly requested to see Elsie's belongings. Not to pry, for Miss Marple never pried, but rather to make sure the girl had all she ought, as she so gently put it. What she sought, however, was neither photograph nor keepsake. It was the pair of shoes neatly placed beside the modest trunk, shoes worn that very morning and still faintly creased from use. They were spotless, not simply clean. One expects a maid's shoes to be well maintained, but entirely untouched by the damp soil that encircled the sundial where Elsie's body had been found. Not a smudge of earth, not a trace of morning dew. Even the heels bore no indentation of soft ground. Miss Marple said nothing at the time. She merely made note, in the quiet space of her mind, where facts settled until ready to speak for themselves. It did not follow. A girl could not cross the garden, tread the path to the sundial, and stand beneath the drooping boughs without leaving some trace. If the shoes were clean, they had not walked there. If they had not walked there, then Elsie had not died where she lay. She had been moved, and not long after death. That one detail, as unassuming as the girl herself, altered everything. It meant calculation. It meant intent. It meant that someone had wished her body found, not hidden. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the kind of cruelty that wore a civilized face. The whispers began with Mrs. Crouch, who had never possessed the restraint to hold her tongue when something more interesting could be let loose from it. She had been sweeping her front step when Elsie passed by 2 days prior, and the girl had paused, not to chat, but to boast, in that playful, half-serious manner the young sometimes adopted when they felt powerful. "I found something," she'd said, "that could ruin someone's lovely little life." At the time, Mrs. Crouch assumed it referred to some romantic entanglement, or perhaps a petty quarrel among the staff. But now, with Elsie dead and the village bristling with unspoken suspicion, the words struck a different chord. Miss Marple listened, not to the declaration itself, but to the tone in which it had been delivered. Elsie had not sounded frightened. She had sounded proud. There is a particular danger in that kind of pride. It is not the recklessness of youth, but the temptation of holding something one believes gives power. And power, especially in a place where one has so little, can be a fatal illusion. The question, then, was not simply what Elsie had found, but whom it endangered. The watch, the drawer of medals, the strange letters, they were pieces of a larger truth, a truth that, if revealed, would shame someone accustomed to being above shame. Miss Marple rose from her chair with a quiet sigh. It was not the girl's curiosity that had killed her. It was what she had read between the lines. Miss Marple had never been one to interfere without cause. Curiosity, yes, but interference was another matter, reserved only for those moments when the world shifted from curious to wrong. And now, with a dead girl's hand clutching a watch too old for her station, a sundial marked by silence, and letters that arrived without names, she felt it was time to revisit an old acquaintance. Sir Geoffrey Helberton, once a circuit judge and now retired to a modest flat in Bayswater, had been a man of reputation and unusual clarity. Miss Marple had met him during her niece's unfortunate entanglement with a certain legal misunderstanding regarding a will, and they had remained cordial correspondents ever since. She wrote, of course, with discretion. She did not mention death or poison, only a name, Elliot Marston. The reply came in 2 days, prompt, concise, and touched with melancholy. Sir Geoffrey remembered the case, a young man, bright and promising, caught in the shadow of a tragedy not entirely of his making. There had been a girl, Marian Cresswell, and a scandal, but no charges, only silence, and a vanishing act that had impressed even the most seasoned members of the bench. The letter closed with a single line that Miss Marple read more than once. It was not guilt that condemned him, Miss Marple. It was the absence of a defense. She folded the paper carefully, placed it inside her knitting basket, and resumed work on a pair of socks she was making for the church bazaar. If Elliot Marston had become Mr. Elliot Crane, it was not to escape justice. It was to escape memory. And as Miss Marple well understood, memory was seldom content to remain hidden, especially when tied to the name of a woman who had once whispered in sleep. It had been, in its day, one of those whispered about affairs that made the back pages of the broadsheets and the front steps of respectable households buzz with speculative chatter. A girl of good family, clever, well-placed, and privately unhappy, found dead in her London flat. A vial of laudanum at her side, and a letter too smudged to be legible. Her name was Marian Cresswell. What elevated the tragedy into scandal was not the death alone. Suicides were, sadly, not uncommon among the well-bred, but the presence of a man. Elliot Marston, a lecturer in history, 10 years her senior, and, by every account, her confidant. There had been speculation, of course, the nature of their relationship, the content of the blurred letter, the whispers that Marian had intended to leave her family, or worse, expose something within it. The Cresswells were not just respectable, they were influential. And Elliot Marston, though blameless in court, was tried in conversation and quietly condemned. Miss Marple, piecing it together from Sir Geoffrey's remarks and her own research, noted that there had never been an inquest with teeth, no firm timeline, no formal interrogation of character. Marston had vanished before such things could be required of him, taking with him whatever truth the smudged letter failed to tell. What lingered, Miss Marple observed, was the residue, the kind that clings to names long after deeds are forgotten. Elliot Marston had become a man who had once been something, and that was often a greater burden than guilt. Now, years later, under the name Elliot Crane, he had reappeared in a village that prized civility and abhorred unanswered questions. He had arrived with a watch in his pocket, a sundial in his view, and a ghost in his sleep. Miss Marple thought not of justice just yet, but of sorrow. For there are wounds that fester not because they are deep, but because they were never permitted to close. And in the distance, always, the name Marian seemed to echo, not as accusation, but as loss. In her quiet study of people, Miss Marple had learned that men who wielded power seldom did so with visible force. It was, more often than not, the subtle redirection of consequences that betrayed their strength and their fear. Sir Geoffrey's letter made mention of Marian Cresswell's father only briefly, but with unmistakable distaste. An MP of significant standing, Reginald Cresswell had built a career on reputation, decorum, and moral clarity. That his daughter's death had occurred under a cloud was, in itself, an affront to the very narrative he had so carefully constructed. And so, the cloud was dispersed. No scandal, no accusations. The press redirected, the family shielded. The letter, which may have named names or cried for help, was declared unintelligible and sealed away. Elliot Marston, though neither charged nor defended, was painted as inappropriate company and disappeared without protest. Miss Marple, recalling Mr. Crane's precise manner and studied neutrality, now understood its origin. It was the posture of a man taught that truth does not always serve the living. As for Marian, what remained was speculation, that she had intended to run away, that she had threatened exposure of some impropriety, that her death had been more than despair, that it had been the final gesture of a girl made voiceless in a house full of reputation. Miss Marple did not know what had broken Marian, only that silence had been its accomplice. And now, years later, silence had struck again, in the death of a maid who found something she should not. The past, it seemed, had stirred, and justice, long muffled beneath the weight of names and titles, had begun to reach through the soil, like a hand from beneath the sundial, searching not for vengeance, but for heir. It was Miss Marple's nature to observe not only what was spoken, but what lingered unsaid, the hesitations, the small vanishing points in conversation where memory and conscience often intersected. And so, during a particularly quiet tea with Mrs. Weatherby, she turned the subject, as if by accident, to wedding gifts. "Oh, I recall a most unusual clock I once saw in a friend's drawing room." Miss Marple mused lightly. "A French mantelpiece one with a hidden drawer beneath the dial." Mrs. Weatherby, without thinking, replied that she too possessed such a thing, a wedding present from her late husband's uncle. "Charming but temperamental," she added. "It hasn't worked for years." Miss Marple said nothing at the time, but that evening she consulted her notes, retracing what little she knew of Marian Cresswell's possessions. Among them had been a gifted clock, elaborately inscribed, imported from France, and last known to be in Elliot Marston's keeping. The connection was faint, but in matters of truth, faint connections often bore the weight of finality. What if Marian, silenced by circumstance, had left her voice not in her final spoken words, but in something quietly kept, a letter never posted, a farewell never read? If that clock had found its way from Elliot Marston to the Weatherby household, through auction or misfortune, then Marian's story might still linger within it. Miss Marple thought again of the sundial in the garden, and Mr. Crane's habit of visiting it, not with admiration, but with intent. Perhaps the message had been hidden not behind a ticking face, but beneath the patient shadow of time itself. Miss Marple was not one to make demands. She made suggestions which, like ivy, wound their way gently into action. And so, with the aid of Mrs. Weatherby's unassuming trust, she found herself in the garden one still morning, ostensibly to admire the late roses. The sundial stood as always, dignified in weathered stone. But Miss Marple, who had once examined Roman ruins with her nephew Raymond, noted a peculiarity in the pedestal, a thin seam around the base, too precise to be natural, and a faint irregularity in the moss along one side. She bent, not hurriedly, and pressed against a shallow indentation. A click, almost imperceptible, followed. With gentle persistence, the base shifted. From within the hollow stone, wrapped in waxed cloth and yellowed by time, was a letter, folded thrice and sealed in brittle wax, the initials MC pressed into its crumbling surface. She said nothing, not yet. She only stared for a long moment, then tucked the parcel into her sleeve. Later that evening, in the privacy of her parlor and the familiarity of lamplight, she opened it with careful fingers. The paper was thin but legible, the ink faded but firm. The words were not those of desperation. They were lucid, calm, deliberate, the kind written when hope has fled, but clarity has come. It was Marian's farewell, but not to the world. To Elliot, she wrote of her father, of the threats, the emotional siege, the ultimatum to marry a man she did not love or face ruin. She wrote of Elliot's attempts to shield her, the plan to leave, the night they said goodbye. The letter ended with a final act of decision. If I do not make it through the night, know it was not fear, but freedom I sought. Miss Marple sat motionless, the paper resting like frost in her lap. The voice of the dead had spoken, and in doing so, had changed everything. The next morning Miss Marple took tea as usual, wrote 2 brief notes, and packed away her knitting with deliberate slowness. She knew now not only the nature of the truth, but the weight of it, and how, once unearthed, truth did not merely illuminate, but cast new shadows where others had once lived in ignorance. The letter, folded now into clean parchment and sealed in a plain envelope, was placed into the hands of Mr. Crane, who received it without question. He read it alone, standing by the parlor window, the morning light casting its pale fingers across the page. He did not speak, but his shoulders, long held in studied reserve, fell with the weight of years untethered. When at last he looked at Miss Marple, there was no need for words. She had seen that expression before, in widows who had never been wives, in soldiers who had buried their own truth in the name of dignity. Later, in quiet confidence, Miss Marple delivered the full contents of the letter to the village constable, and to Sir Geoffrey, who advised discretion, not secrecy. No crime had been committed by Elliot Crane, none proven, none pursued, only a life lost, and another displaced by the fallout of one man's ambition, and one girl's desperate attempt to reclaim her voice. Mrs. Weatherby, ever gracious, asked no questions when the sundial was disturbed again. She was, in her way, relieved. She had long suspected her garden held more than worms beneath its soil. The letter was offered, not to the newspapers but to the local historical society, where it would rest in quiet obscurity, catalogued as a footnote to a time now passing. For Elliot Crane it meant something far greater than reputation. It meant exoneration, not in the eyes of strangers but in the memory of the one whose absence had defined him. Miss Marple, later recounting the affair to her nephew with suitable restraint, ended the matter simply. "There are some ghosts, Raymond," she said, "who do not wish to haunt, but merely to be heard." And now, at last, Marian Cresswell had been. It was during a routine gathering of the Women's Fellowship Committee that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Anstruther, delivered her latest grievance in a tone half apology, half righteous worry. 2 spoons had gone missing, not just any spoons, but part of the silver set inherited from her grandmother, engraved and irreplaceable. "I wouldn't have mentioned it," she began, folding her gloves neatly on the table. "But there's something rather unsettling about things simply vanishing. The incident on its own might have passed unremarked, items mislaid, servants blamed, memory blamed even more. Yet the timing proved inconvenient. Mr. Crane had visited the vicarage earlier that week, under the most polite pretext, inquiring about the parish archives for his so-called book on 18th century timepieces. Miss Marple made no comment at the time, but privately, she noted how suspicion, when starved of fact, fed instead on the stranger in the room. Mr. Crane, to those who judged by stillness, had a manner too composed, the sort mistaken for calculation by those inclined to mistrust the unfamiliar. It was not theft that interested Miss Marple, but the nature of rumor, and how quickly it could shift a man from quiet lodger to suspected thief. Dr. Pendleton was a man of efficiency, more interested in illness than character, and therefore an unlikely participant in village gossip. Yet even the most seasoned of physicians could not wholly extinguish the embers of personal disappointment. Long ago, before London had swallowed her name in scandal, Marian Cresswell had once been summer guest to the Pendleton family. Her presence had left its mark. The doctor, younger then, had carried a quiet admiration for her, one never returned and barely acknowledged, but visible in the way he spoke her name even years later. Miss Marple, having known such longing in others, discerned a bitterness in his tone when the name Elliot Marston arose, a faint tightening of the lips, a disapproval wrapped in clinical objectivity, and while he had no reason nor time to be involved in Elsie's death, Miss Marple knew that resentment often ripened into motive, not in action, but in sentiment. A man who had lost not to tragedy, but to another's shadow, could carry that weight indefinitely. It was not guilt she suspected in Dr. Pendleton, but grievance. And in matters of grief and jealousy, one need not lift a hand to be entangled. Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, Claude, arrived in St. Mary Mead under the guise of familial affection, but the village quickly noted his fondness for cards, spirits, and excuses. He was charming in the way young men often are when charm becomes currency, and behind every joke lay the edge of quiet desperation. It was whispered that he owed money, not just in London but nearer, to people who did not easily forget. He had known Elsie, of course, the sort of knowing that came from shared smokes by the scullery, and flirtation too careless to be innocent. But what caught Miss Marple's ear was a single remark from the grocer's boy, overheard near the post office, that Claude and Elsie had argued days before her death, voices raised, threats implied. Mrs. Weatherby insisted her nephew was incapable of such cruelty. "He has his flaws," she said gently, "but he's family." Miss Marple made no contradiction, but quietly considered how much cruelty often hides within the folds of kinship, how debts and desperation can turn affection into leverage. Claude had access to the garden. He had known the sundial's placement, and if Elsie had spoken out of turn, or found something meant to stay buried, then perhaps his secrets ran deeper than gambling. In every village there are those who traffic in gossip, as others do in flour or coal, and Mrs. Crouch was their unchallenged merchant. It was she who gave voice to the rumor that Elsie had been blackmailing someone. "I heard it clear as bells," she declared at the grocer's, "said she had proof of something, and that it'd fetch her enough to leave service altogether." Miss Marple, though not inclined to believe such tales at first telling, knew there was often a grain of truth embedded in even the most embellished tale. Blackmail was not too strong a word. Not if the girl had stumbled upon something she did not understand, but instinctively recognized as valuable. The letter, perhaps, or knowledge of Mr. Crane's identity, or something else, financial, emotional, or familial, tied to the Weatherby name. Whatever it was, it had turned Elsie from maid to liability, and in a house where too many people had too much to lose, Miss Marple pondered a chilling question. Who would have seen a servant's silence as the price of peace? And who, she thought with growing clarity, would find such silence far too dear? Her brief conversation with Mr. Grantham, the Weatherby family solicitor, revealed an overlooked detail. The garden sundial, though long assumed decorative, had once been appraised for insurance purposes. The figure was significant. More interesting still, the record showed a discrepancy. The declared value was half the original appraisal. Only the someone aware of its hidden compartment could account for that change. Miss Marple made her way home slowly, thoughts turning not only to letters and poison, but to the possibility that someone had known all along what the sundial concealed, and had waited patiently, year after year, for their moment. The final revelation came not in thunder but in earth. A torn glove, unearthed near the sundial by the gardener while tending to the asters. It was leather, expensive, too fine for a laborer or maid. It bore a tear across the palm, as though from gripping stone, and when presented to Miss Marple, she noted its make with quiet finality. She had seen its twin weeks earlier. It belonged to Claude. And so the story narrowed, not with certainty but with shape. The truth, once veiled in inheritance and silence, now wore fingerprints, and a glove too fine for innocence. There was nothing conspicuous about the invitation. No sense of urgency, no cryptic phrasing. Miss Marple merely suggested a modest tea at the vicarage, under the pleasant guise of thanking a few dear acquaintances for their recent kindnesses. Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crane, Dr. Pendleton, Claude, and even the vicar's wife all accepted, drawn less by curiosity than by the simple inertia of village life. The table was set with restrained charm, lemon slices for tea, anchovy toast, and a plum sponge Miss Marple claimed was a little overdone. Conversation fluttered, as it often did, from the matter of dahlias to the state of the high street hedging. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet current pulsed. When the moment arrived, it did not do so with drama, but with the gentle clearing of Miss Marple's throat. "There is something," she began, "that needs saying." And so, in her soft and measured voice, never didactic, never self-important, she laid the path before them, not as an accusation but as a careful unspooling of facts. The room did not still, for it had never been restless, but a hush settled, the kind that arrives not from fear but from the anticipation of something long withheld. Miss Marple continued, her eyes moving gently from one face to the next, and what she spoke of was not murder alone, but memory, motive, and the small human cruelties which, though rarely named, leave deeper scars than the gravest of crimes. Miss Marple began, as she always did, not with drama, but with detail. Elsie, she explained, had dusted Mr. Crane's room the morning of her death, an errand she had volunteered for, which in itself was unusual. While tidying, she had discovered something, a folded letter, long forgotten, tucked into the false bottom of a small traveling case. The letter, she continued gently, was written by Marian Cresswell, a farewell not to the world, but to Elliot Marston, who had once been her protector, and later, her silence. In it, Marian confessed not despair but defiance, her refusal to be coerced by her father, her intention to run, and the emotional torment that preceded her final act. For Elsie, the discovery was a turning point. She understood only that the letter was old, deeply personal, and potentially valuable. She hinted to others, Mrs. Crouch among them, that she held a secret worth more than her wages, and that, Miss Marple concluded with quiet finality, was her undoing. What Elsie never knew was the letter's second implication. It proved not only Mr. Crane's innocence, but also threatened to revive a scandal, long buried, a scandal that still had the power to tarnish reputations and sever delicate family ties. She did not know the names involved, only that they mattered, and in her excitement she told the wrong person. Claude, Mrs. Weatherby's nephew, had debts, not just of coin, but of character. He had overheard Elsie's remarks, perhaps even seen the letter. He understood its worth not as history, but as leverage. And for a man cornered by desperation, the opportunity was too tempting to ignore. The letter was not merely a confession from the past. It was a key, and Elsie, naive and proud, had tried to wield it. Miss Marple now spoke of method, the calm logistics of a murder executed not in rage but in calculation. Claude had access to the Sundial garden, to the drawer of old medicines, and most damningly, to the very watch Elsie had been found holding. A watch that, Miss Marple pointed out, once belonged to Mrs. Weatherby's late husband and had been locked away with his other belongings. It had been removed days before the murder. The poison, digitalis, was not common, but neither was it unobtainable. Mrs. Weatherby still kept old remedies in her attic cupboard, including foxglove tincture once used to calm her husband's heart. It had not been touched in years, until now. Miss Marple explained that Elsie had been lured to the garden with the promise of money, or perhaps a meeting to discuss her discovery. She had been given tea or sweets, or something innocuous containing the fatal dose, and once the deed was done, her body had been carried to the sundial, posed, watch in hand, as if time had mocked her full. The scene was too precise. The shoes, Miss Marple reminded them gently, bore no soil. The ground where she lay showed no signs of struggle. It had been arranged, deliberately, cruelly, to implicate another. Mr. Crane, already the subject of suspicion, had been the ideal scapegoat, a man with a murky past, solitary habits, and a name few could place. But poison does not lie, and gloves, torn in haste and buried too shallowly, do not bury the truth. Miss Marple turned to Claude then, not with triumph, but with a quiet, pitying resolve. Desperation, she said, could twist even loyalty into weaponry. And in his silence, the truth stood naked, needing no confession. Miss Marple now turned her attention to the physical details, those small, unimposing fragments that, when assembled, spoke louder than accusation. The watch, she explained, had been locked for years in a drawer with the late Colonel Weatherby's war memorabilia. Its sudden reappearance, clutched in the maid's hand, was no coincidence. It had been removed before the murder, planted not only to mislead, but to invoke a specific kind of symbolism. A broken watch, stopped at 6:17, intended to suggest a fatal hour, a detail too theatrical to arise naturally. Miss Marple noted that it had been wound fully, despite Mr. Crane's insistence that he never touched it. As for the glove, found buried shallowly in the soil behind the sundial, it was of expensive calfskin, too fine for any laborer, too masculine for any of the ladies present. Its mate had been seen weeks earlier, on Claude's left hand, during a village outing when he fancied himself stylish. The torn palm matched the rough stone edge of the sundial's pedestal, and soil embedded in the lining suggested it had been used recently, in haste. It was not merely that these clues existed, Miss Marple said gently. It was that they did not belong. They had been introduced, just as the poison had, just as the suspicion toward Mr. Crane had been seeded. Each item, each whisper, had been laid with care, but the hand that planted them lacks subtlety, and when truth is disturbed, she had it. It does not cry out. It shifts, uneasily, imperfectly, and leaves behind, always, the fingerprints of its manipulator. Now that the illusion had been dismantled, Miss Marple drew the veil from motive, not the extravagant ones of thrill or hatred. Those belonged to novels and overheated imaginations, but the far more common, far more human failings: debt, desperation, envy. Claude had returned to St. Mary Mead not out of affection for his aunt, but because London had grown too narrow for his credit and too broad for his lies. Debtors pressed, prospects waned, and the quiet wealth of Mrs. Weatherby's household, though modest, gleamed in his imagination like a final lifeline. Then came the maid's secret. To Claude, the letter meant not guilt or innocence, but opportunity, a document capable of stirring scandal, embarrassing the family, unsettling the peace, and perhaps, if withheld or sold carefully, capable of profit. That the letter might clear a man's name or honor a woman's memory never entered his arithmetic. But more dangerous than greed was the wound of resentment. Claude had always lived beneath other men's shadows. Now, Mr. Crane's quiet dignity, his poised manner, and his possible redemption stood as a fresh insult. Miss Marple paused, her eyes resting on Claude without anger. "It was not cruelty that moved you," she said, her tone neither cold nor warm. "It was the belief that you had been forgotten, and the bitter desire to matter, even through harm." And in that moment Claude's silence said more than protest ever could. As the gathering quietly dispersed, Mr. Crane remained seated, the envelope unfolded in his lap. He read the letter, not as one who discovers, but as one who finally receives. His hands did not tremble, his face did not change, but in the stillness there was release, not vindication, for that belonged to public matters. What he now held was private. A voice he had long feared lost, now returned in ink and paper. Marian had spoken, and at last, without interruption or rumor, he had heard her, and no one could take that from him again. It were some days after the gathering that Mr. Crane, or rather, Elliot Marston, returned to the village with a letter folded in his coat pocket, and his chin held a shade higher than before. He had not changed in manner, nor in dress, but there was a lightness about his presence, a quiet relinquishing of the vigilance he had carried like a second skin. The magistrate, upon receiving Miss Marple's notes and the late Marian's letter, saw no need for further inquiry. The affair, so long ago extinguished in public record but not in private conscience, was closed. No wrongdoing remained to be punished, and no one now living stood accused. But something greater than acquittal had occurred. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Mr. Marston signed his name without hesitation. The village, as villages do, adjusted with measured grace. Mr. Crane became Mr. Marston, as naturally as one adopts a maiden aunt's dog. There was talk, yes, but in St. Mary Mead, talk is not always condemnation. Sometimes it is simply the village's way of wrapping its arms around an unexpected truth. Miss Marple, observing the gentle shift, noted how the human soul does not require vindication so much as it desires recognition, to be seen as one is, not merely as one was once believed to be. And in Elliot's case, the past had finally loosened its hold. No longer a ghost, no longer a shadow, just a man, walking once more beneath the village's polite scrutiny, not with fear, but with the long-denied comfort of belonging. It was Elliot's decision, unprompted, quiet, and made without ceremony, to entrust Marian's final letter to the local historical society, not in display but in preservation. Filed under a category too dull for scandal and too refined for gossip, private correspondence, early 20th century, personal estate transfer. Miss Marple, upon hearing this, nodded with a satisfaction that was not pride but relief. It was the proper place, not buried, not broadcast, but held with dignity, as befits the final words of a young woman who had never been allowed to speak freely in life. The curator, a woman with sensible shoes and reverent hands, accepted the document with solemn gratitude. She would, she assured Elliot, store it in the small climate-controlled drawer beside other local letters, love notes, civic petitions, small quarrels of interest to no one and everyone. In this quiet act, Elliot offered more than a confession nor a memento. He offered a voice, for Marian had not only cleared his name in that letter, she had given shape to her own. No longer merely the tragic daughter of a powerful man, nor the girl whispered about in drawing rooms. Now, in careful handwriting and pressed parchment, she lived again, not in pain, nor in scandal, but in truth. Miss Marple later remarked, not aloud but to herself as she stitched a hem, that justice, when properly served, has no appetite for spectacle. It simply restores what was lost and lays it gently back in place. The garden recovered in time, as gardens do, even after storms. Mrs. Weatherby, who had once spoken of pulling up the sundial entirely, chose instead to leave it untouched. She pruned around it, laid fresh gravel along the path, but never again dusted the pedestal, nor mentioned its presence. It remained not as a monument to death, but as a quiet acknowledgment of truth. The foxgloves bloomed late that year, tall, stately, unrepentant. Miss Marple, while walking with her parasol one morning, remarked on the symmetry of it. Sometimes, she said to no one in particular, nature insists on being heard, even in silence. Claude, now quite departed under firm legal advisement, was spoken of less often with each passing week. His absence left a space but not a wound. Mrs. Weatherby continued to tend her roses not as distraction, but with renewed affection. For what is a garden, after all, but a testament to survival? Mr. Marston, too, resumed his walks, no longer at odd hours, but during the gentle hum of the village's waking hours. He no longer stared at the sundial. He simply passed by. Miss Marple, observing it all, thought of how little the world changes, and how deeply people do, not in the dramatic ways, but in the soft turns, the quiet acts of forgiveness, of continuation. The sundial remained a symbol, of course, but now, not of concealment, of patience, of time as healer, not accomplice. And for those who passed through the garden unaware, it was simply a stone among blooms. But for those who knew, it marked not the hour of death, but the moment truth returned, and remained. There were afternoons when the village resumed its regular rhythm so perfectly, one might forget the recent interruption altogether. But Miss Marple did not forget, not out of stubbornness, but out of her lifelong understanding that what is unsaid often holds more meaning than what is spoken. She sat by her parlor window, a skein of soft wool in her lap, her needles clicking with the steady cadence of thought. The village moved outside her window, bicycles, postmen, schoolchildren, all innocently unaware of how close a secret had come to remaining buried once more. She considered the peculiar way truth travels, not in straight lines but in echoes. Marian's voice, long silenced by her father's power and the shame imposed upon women who dared resist, had finally been heard, not loudly, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Miss Marple did not seek satisfaction in having been right. Her pleasure came from subtler places, the absence of injustice, the restoration of something quietly broken, the small measure of peace returned to a man who had once carried exile in his posture. She reflected, too, on Elsie, young, impetuous, and ultimately brave in the way only the underestimated ever truly are. Her pride had cost her everything, and yet, without it, the truth would have remained hidden. And so, Miss Marple knitted. Not because she had nothing more to do, but because in knitting, one sees the pattern revealed slowly, strand by strand, until what was tangled becomes whole. She thought then of something she had once read, though she could not remember where. Justice is a quiet thing. It does not cry out. It waits. And as the needles worked, she smiled, for justice, at last, had stopped waiting. The clock on Miss Marple's mantel chimed 4 with its usual politeness. Not a sound of urgency, but of continuity. She poured her tea, 1 lump of sugar, no cream, and reached for the shortbread biscuits she had arranged in a neat ring upon a floral saucer. Outside, the birds made no fuss. The air was mild. The village had at last returned to itself. Miss Marple sipped thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the old clock. A simple piece, nothing of grandeur, but well kept and faithful. It had lost time only once, after a thunderstorm, and had since been tended with greater care than most would grant a mechanical object. She found comfort in its ticking. It reminded her that justice, like time, does not always strike when expected. Sometimes it delays. Sometimes it arrives dressed not as a judge but as a letter, or a glove, or a quiet girl with a stubborn sense of right. She thought of Elliot Marston now, not as the man who arrived under a false name, but as the one who had stayed after his truth was known. She thought of Marian, whose voice had traveled farther in death than her silence had ever permitted in life. And she thought of Claude, who had underestimated not only his aunt's loyalty, but the old woman in the corner chair with the knitting needles. The mantel clock ticked once more. Miss Marple took another sip and placed her teacup down with care. There would be another mystery, of course. There always was. But for now, the garden was quiet, the air was kind, and justice had made its slow and proper way. Not loudly, not with fanfare, just in time. Sometimes it's not the loudest voices that carry the deepest truths, but the quiet ones, buried beneath silence, loss, and time. In this mystery, Miss Marple reminded us that justice doesn't always arrive in haste, but in patience. A broken name was mended, a forgotten letter found its way home, and beneath the garden sundial, a long-buried truth was brought back into the light, not with noise, but with quiet dignity. Elsie's courage, however unknowing, gave voice to a young woman who had once been silenced by power, and through Miss Marple's gentle observation, the past was no longer hidden. It was honored. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.